Women at this time had very limited options. They would either marry or join the nunnery. And last time I didn't talk about religion, and this section focuses on religion. And the religion that I'm talking about is because the Middle Ages was the Catholic Church. These will be nuns and the roles of the nunneries and the different types of nunneries, as well as learning about the women who ruled the convent. And those women that ruled the convent were known as abbesses. So let us get started in women in the religion in the Middle Ages. Most young girls who became nuns came from noble families, and these girls often brought dowries to their convents. And this was to help maintain the estate of the convent. And a girl could become a nun at the age of 14 or 15. This was the official age. However, a lot of girls entered the convent and became nuns at a younger age. For instance, St. Gertrude, she became a nun at the age of 5 years old. And so, yes, most girls were young when they took their vows, small children. And the girls entered the convent either by choice or by force, which means their parents forced them to join the nunnery because some of them were poor and couldn't afford to feed them, so they would either force them to join the nunnery. A woman could not abandon a nunnery. If she was, it was a grave sin. And if a woman left the nunnery and married, she would be excommunicated, and that would be seen as shame. So this is a picture, an ancient manuscript of abbess of white nuns, and they cut your hair of a novice. So when you're a novice, you cut your hair, become a nun. So it's symbolic. Okay, so what were the orders of the nunneries? Before nunneries were institutionalized, the nuns, they liked to live near a church or in a religious recluse, like a religious community. And after they became institutionalized, they lived in a community. It was all community. And the first female order were the Benedictines, and they started in the 6th century. In fact, most depiction of a nun is often a Benedictine nun, you know, dressed in black robe with a veil, black veil. That's a Benedictine nun. And most nuns from the high Middle Ages were from the Benedictine order. So if you think about a nun, you would most likely be thinking of a Benedictine order. In the 12th century, there were the Cistercian order, and a small number of women joined the Carthusian order. In the early 13th century, the nuns, a nun named St. Clare formed the Dominican order and the order of St. Clare. So there was a Dominican order and the order of St. Clare arose. All of the orders except for the Carthusian, you know, are fairly similar to each other. So there's a similar routine that they would use. However, the Carthusian is more secular. They were more hermit-like. And this is a picture of the Cistercian nuns going to Mass, a procession of nuns going to Mass. And this is a picture of a medieval nun. So a nun's day was divided up by prayer, labor, and reading. So those 3 sections, aspects of their daily life. Most of their time was devoted to prayer and liturgical hymns. And they recite their first prayer, the matins and the lauds. And they would get up at 2 a.m. and they would recite these prayers until dawn and then begin their daily work. And they went to bed around 9 o'clock at night. So 5 hours of the day were dedicated to work. The rest was broken into reading and eating the 3 meals. The poor nunneries would do household chores and lunch was accompanied with recitations or reading from a book. The last prayers was said at 8, and after complines, which ended at 9, they would go to bed and get up at 2 in the morning. So they did this every day. It was their daily life. And I am going to show you a video of a song by Hildegard of Bingen. And you should know Hildegard of Bingen because this woman was one of the most accomplished women in the Middle Ages. She was a composer, a physician, and she was a musician, a writer, and we'll talk about her as a writer, and also an artist. And so this was a very accomplished woman. She was one of the first female physicians of the Middle Ages, and as well as a musician. And so this is a song that I am going to show because it is about what nuns sang during their devotion. So she wrote this, so this is what her nuns were saying during her devotions. And the reason why that it is sung is because at the time in the Middle Ages, it was the voice. The voice was the most important aspect of music because any other instrument don't have any words. You can't express your love of God, so they only chose the voice because you can express your love to God and God could hear it. So that is why song at that time, voice, is the most important aspect of music in the Middle Ages. Alright, so what were the roles of the abbey? Well, we're going to talk about the abbess first because the abbess was the head of the abbey. She would rule the abbey. They were wealthy women and often from the nobility. And these women were appointed because of their connection with a court or a nobleman. In some cases, abbesses had no superior to report to except the monarch themselves. So these women were very powerful and privileged because they didn't have to report to anyone other than the monarch. So their actions were respected and followed. And the abbess of rich nunneries, they could have extensive land holdings, which means that the abbess exercised the same powers of a landlord. And the abbess would preside over the peasants that were on her lands, and they would cultivate the lands of peasants. Therefore, the abbess needed a strong business sense to run the estate and manage the income. So she was like a noblewoman. This was her role. In double religious houses where monks and nuns lived together, it was the abbess and not the male abbot who was in charge. So even if there were monks living there too, it was a woman, the abbess, who was in charge and not the male abbot. And the reason why this abbess is given so much authority and power is because of her relation to the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. And she was seen as the Virgin's successor on earth as Mary had ascended into heaven. So that is why she was given power, because Mary has ascended into heaven and the abbess is her successor, her chosen people. So this is a portrait of a nun, St. Gertrude of Nivelles. So these are roles that an abbess would do at a daily life. Not only would she run the abbey and maintain the estates, but she also collected taxes and donations, selected priests for the nuns' order from local churches, supervised girls in convent schools, and if the monarch required it, the abbess, she could send out troops. So she could raise troops and send them out to war. And as a landowner, the abbess could be summoned to Parliament and she could initiate legal cases. And she was also seen as a spiritual leader. In some cases, she could even preach or even take on the role of confessor, which was, at the time, confession was only given by the priest. The abbots had a lot of power in the church. And this is a picture of Hildegard of Bingen and her nuns. And this is most likely a Benedictine order. Okay, so what were the other roles besides abbess? Well, there was a fratress. She was in charge of the dining room. A cellarist was in charge of the food supply. An infirmarist was in charge of the sick. So the infirmarist would be taking care of the sick as well as when her other sisters were sick. And a treasuress, she was in charge of the treasury, the money of the estate, and a kitchenist who was in charge of the kitchen. A sacrist took care of the church sanctuary. A chantress, and this woman managed church services and trained nuns for singing, and also acted as a librarian, because there was a librarian within a monastery. And a chamberess, she was in charge of the nuns' clothing, and the mistresses of novices. And she taught the novices and supervised the nuns' behavior. And last is an almonist who dispersed alms to the poor. And this is a picture of a Benedictine nun. Okay, so what did some luxuries look like? While some nunneries could be poor, many nuns, they loved to live in a life of luxury and comfort. So, especially in rich monasteries. So, these women, they lived comfortably. And according to reports from the bishop who visited these monasteries, nuns were dressed in high fashion, so they didn't have to wear their robes. They were dressed in noblewomen's outfits. They wore makeup. You would think a nun wouldn't wear makeup, but they do. And they ate delicate foods and could keep lapdogs, monkeys, squirrels, and birds. And they could bring their pet animals into the church area, you know, where the mass was held. In fact, one report was a nun's monkey was swinging while they were having mass, were swinging along the pillars while they were having mass. So that was one report. Nuns, they also like to sing secular songs. They love to dance and play games. They also like to drink intoxicating liquor caused the disapproval of the bishops because they weren't living the pious life, a life of piety. And nuns, however, they copy manuscripts and illuminated books. So these women were very educated. They could read and draw. And some nuns wrote to intellectual leaders of their day. So they had very important influence because they can talk to very political figures like kings and advise them on how they should live. Nuns also provided outreach and charity programs as well as other services. And some examples include maintaining hospitals and opening up schools. And this is a picture of a Saint Walburga who was a nun. So we will talk about religious church leaders next. This is Saint Radigan, and this woman was a queen, a French queen in the Middle Ages. And she lived from 520 to 587 CE. And she is often known as the runaway queen because, I'll tell you the story in a minute, she led a fascinating life, a very fascinating life, and I wrote an article about her, a biography of her in the History of Royal Women. So, most Frankish queens were known for their notoriety, however, not Saint Radegund, because Saint Radegund was known for her piety. Okay. She was a princess of Thuringia, Radegund, and she was the daughter of a prince of Thuringia, so she was a princess, and which was a central province in central Germany. However, at the age of 12, she was kidnapped by the Franks, who conquered the area. They invaded the kingdom, and they kidnapped her. And she became a prize to the Frankish king Clothar, who is the son of Clovis I and Saint Clothild. And this is interesting because Clothar was the son of a guy that brought Christianity into the Frankish kingdom, who made Christianity the main religion in France. However, these two parents were known to be very pious. However, Clothar was not pious. He was wicked, and he murdered his brothers to take the throne. So this is not a pious man. He was very wicked. King Clothar educated her. She learned to read and write and learn about the Catholic religion, and her education encouraged her to be pious by nature. And she was known to have a love of the scriptures. While she was studying under King Clothar, he fell in love with her and wanted to marry her. And she was reluctant, but eventually she had no choice but to marry the French king. Eventually, she married him, and she became queen in 540. However, the marriage was not happy, and it produced no children. Queen Radegund didn't want to be in bed with him, and she would pray hours on the cold pavement, and she was often mocked in court as being the queen nun. So this made King Clothar took various women as concubines. However, it allowed Queen Radegund to pursue other ascetic interests. For example, she liked to take an interest in caring for sick women. She built luxurious beds and baths for them so she could bathe and tend to them. And because of her charity, the queen was viewed as a servant of the people. So while the people at court mocked her and hated her and laughed at her, the French people, they saw her as a saint, and they admired her and respected her. And this is taken from the life of Saint Radegund, a page of it. So in 550 CE, King Clothar killed Queen Radegund's brother because he was the last male descendant of the Thuringian royal family. And Queen Radegund, who's been wanting to escape the marriage a long time, finally found the reason to do so when King Clothar killed her brother, and she ran away from court. She ran from her husband and sought protection with the church in Tours. She was appointed a deaconess, and King Clothar tried to bring his wife back to court. However, the church intervened. They negotiated with the French king to help Radegund establish her own nunnery, so he didn't take her back, and she instead formed her own monastery. In 560, Radegund founded the monastery of St. Croix, named after the true cross in Poitiers. More than 200 women lived in the monastery, and they lived by the rule created by the Bishop Caesarius of Arles, who's a saint. And this was a strict monastery law and regulation, right? The nuns, they lived in poverty, and they frequently fasted and prayed. They also had to pursue intellectual activities like reading 2 hours each day. And these laws were so strict that the nuns could not even attend Radegund's funeral. So her own nuns couldn't attend her funeral. However, Saint Gregory visited it, and he described her face was bright. And many people began to think that she was a saint because many miracles, when they prayed to her, many miracles happened. And so people made her a saint. And You can still go to St. Radigan's tomb, which can be seen today in Poitiers. And this is a picture of the Queen Nun. So even though, you know, she was mocked, called the Queen Nun, she really was respected for her piety. And no other Frankish queen, they were all known for their notoriousness, and some of them came to a bad end, like a soap opera, but she didn't have a soap opera much. All right, this is another famous saint, Saint Hilda of Whitby, and she was a great niece of Saint Edwin of Northumbria. It was said that she was a pagan until the age of 13, when she converted to Christianity along with her great uncle, King Edwin of England. At the age of 33, she decided to take her religious vows. So why at age 33 did she become a nun? This is most likely because she was married. So after the death of her husband, historians said, she decided to become a nun. In 657, she founded a double monastery in Strioneshouse, now modern-day Whitby, and became abbess. So she got promoted to abbess. Hilda's monastery quickly became a place of intellectual activity. Hilda placed a strong emphasis on education, and she believed that education was the most important aspect of her life, of someone's life. And because of this, many of her monks became bishops when they entered the priesthood. So when the monks who were part of her monastery left, they were respected and they were intellectually talented, and they became bishops after they left. So they went and got promoted after they left her monastery. One member of her abbey was Cayman, and you know who Cayman was? He's supposedly the oldest historian in English. And he was also the earliest English Christian poet. So if you read British Lit, old British Lit, you would probably have read Cayman. And she gained a good reputation, and many kings and princes sought her advice. The abbess' prestige led her to host the Synod of Whitby, and this synod was supposedly a date to solve the conflict. There was a conflict concerning the date of Easter. You see, because there were the Celts, which is what Hilda was a part of, you know, a Celtic monastery, and then there was the Romans, you know, Christianity. So there was a Celtic Christianity and the Roman Christianity. And the Celtic Christianity wanted their own date of Easter. And the Romans wanted the Celtic to follow the Roman date of Easter. So Hilda, she was the one that resolved this conflict. Hilda supported the Celtic date for Easter. However, King Oswy made the decision to follow the Roman calendar. And because of this decision, this led the English to adopt many Roman customs and the Roman usage in England. And it brought the English church in close contact with the Roman church. So they followed the Roman ways rather than their own Celtic ways. And this is a famous saint, Saint Clare of Assisi. She was a disciple of Francis of Assisi. Clare, she was a noblewoman. She was a daughter of Count Favorino Schiffi of Assisi. At the age of 18, she heard Francis of Assisi preach the gospel during Lent. And St. Francis of Assisi was known for being handsome and charismatic. And she immediately fell in love with his teachings right then during that preach. And This sermon made a profound impact on her, and on Palm Sunday she ran away from her home and went to the chapel of Porziuncula, where she was received by Francis. She took vows dedicating her life to God. Clare joined the convent of the Benedictine nuns of St. Angelo in Panzo. Her sister Agnes met her there. Clare's family was very displeased with Clare's flight and tried to bring both of the sisters home. However, they failed. And the sisters later moved to the church of San Damiano. Francis helped Clare to set up her own order, which later became the Order of the St. Clare. And he also appointed her as abbess of San Damiano, and she believed that joyous poverty was an imitation of Christ. In 1224, Frederick II's army came to attack Assisi. Clare came out to meet them, and she stopped the war by carrying the Blessed Sacrament, which is the host. She went and stood at the host and placed the host, and it frightened the army. So she placed the Blessed Sacrament where her enemies could see it, and she begged God for the sisters' protection because they were trying to invade the monastery. So she showed them the host and said that this is God, and she blessed them for protection. Once she had prayed, the soldiers became very frightened, and they fled as fast as they could without harming anyone. So she stopped them from being invaded by having the host and placing it on the wall where they could see, and it frightened them, and they turned around and went back home. Clare continued to be sick and suffered great pains for many years. She was known to be a mystic, where she, suffered pains and supposedly had visions of Jesus. However, she felt immense joy in serving the Lord, and she died at age 59. Pope Innocent IV declared her canonization immediately, and 2 years later, in 1255, she was declared a saint. So this was a very powerful and brave woman. And here's a video of St. Clare, a short one. And this is her sister, St. Agnes of Assisi. And she was the younger sister of St. Clare, who founded the Order of the Poor Clares. At the age of 14, she followed her sister and left her home and joined Clare in the Benedictine convent of St. Angelo di Ponzo. She was invested in the Franciscan habit, and she cut off her hair. She assisted Clare with the founding of her order and became an abbess of a nunnery in Monticelli. She introduced the rules of the Franciscans in convents throughout modern Italy. She claimed to have had visions of Christ child, so she was also like her sister. She was a mystic. And she died 3 months after Clare and is entombed in the church of Santa Chiara. So she's buried in the same burial place as Clare. And this is the story of the female pope, the legend of the female pope, because supposedly during the Middle Ages, there was a female pope. Joan, she was a woman of English descent who was born in Mainz, Germany. So this was a woman who was English but lived in Germany. In around 850, she disguised herself as a man and followed her lover to a university in Athens to be with him. And this was because the university was closed to women and she wanted to be with her lover. She excelled in her studies and moved to Rome, where she joined the priesthood and, of course, to follow her lover, because her lover wanted to be a priest. And she started out as a papal notary and quickly rose up the ranks. So she was known to be very intelligent, and she eventually became a cardinal. And her male name was John. So in 855, she was elected Pope John VIII. Her pontificate only lasted 2 years because it ended in a scandal. Towards the end of her reign, she became pregnant by her lover, whom she followed all the way to university. So in other words, she still had this lover around. During a procession to St. John Lateran, she gave birth to a baby in public. So this was while they were parading through the streets. Suddenly, she was pregnant and hid her pregnancy under loose robes, but she couldn't do it any longer because it was time for the baby to be born. And when the mob saw her give birth to a baby in public, they were so furious that their pope was a woman that they killed the baby and beat Pope Joan to death. Since then, popes have had to verify their gender before they are crowned, and the pontifical processions of St. John Lateran route has been changed. Okay, the truth was, the first mention of Pope Joan was found in a chronicle by the Dominican chronicler Jean de Malley sometime around 1255. The legend was believed to be true in the Middle Ages, so people automatically believed it was a historical fact when you were living in the Middle Ages that there was once a female pope. However, during the 16th century, steps were taken to refute it. And since then, Pope Joan's existence has been debated, and it's still going on today. So people are discussing, is Pope Joan real or is she not? And most historians generally agree that Pope Joan was a myth that was created as a symbol of the church's corruption. And this is because there's no concrete evidence of Pope Joan. Like, we really can't find evidence of whether Joan existed. However, there are still some historians who believe that she may have existed and that there are hints that may prove her existence. And what they are looking at is statues that were attributed to her. But if you look back, those statues were actually attributed to other noble women and not to her. So most likely she's a fable, but right now there's no hard evidence on Pope Joan. But my personal opinion, she's just a story. But you know, it's an interesting debate on whether she was real or not. And at the time, you know, during the Middle Ages, around 1255, there was a schism where there were 3 popes at one time. And at the time, some popes lived in France, and there was a division, so you can see why the author wrote it during the 1255. He was probably displeased with how the church was going on at the time. So this is supposedly Pope Joan and her child. Alright, so these are some facts that I have.